Without further ado, we're now going to move into our panel water sector reform, or our panel on the water sector reform. I'm pleased to introduce Leigh Kissick, who's Senior Associate, Chapman Tripp, based in Wellington. Leigh specialises in project and property finance and has advised the government on all of our PPPs to date, Corrections, NZTA, Ministry of Education. Most impressively, Leigh has a BA in Japanese. Well, that impresses me anyway. I think that's a tough language. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to the panel. Thank you.
I have to start off with konnichiwa, ohayo gozaimasu, Leigh desu. No, but thank you, Pat. Look, first, on behalf of the panel, I just want to thank Minister Mahuta for her words, and also thank you to Richard and Chris. As the speakers have all highlighted, there are issues in the water sector and there is a need for reform. As acknowledged by the DIA in its 3 water material, a system-wide collaborative solution is required to work through these issues. As New Zealanders, we are very passionate about our water, and as the Minister has noted, water is critical and the status quo is not sustainable. So look, without further ado, I am going to invite the panel members up. So Karl, Nicholson, ANZ, David Walker, GHD, and Raveen, Jaduram, CE of Watercare. Great, that's a bit better. Right, so look, first we're just going to talk, I'm going to ask a very overarching question to each of you, and then look, we are going to touch on regulation, aggregation of suppliers, funding and financing and privatisation. So first, I think the first question is just what are the big challenges and opportunities in the water sector right now? We'll wait for Raveen later. So David, perhaps we start with you.
I think at an overall level, we use this term resilience, but it's really couched in the term of climate change. But I think it actually is a good term for the whole water ecosystem, because as the earlier speakers outlined, there's a whole sort of potpourri of issues, and they're not new. I think I was probably sitting here in about 2008 following a study that we did for the NZCID as it was in those days, and it sort of was still highlighting all the same types of issues around funding, capacity, capability and the like. So there hasn't been a lot hasn't really changed that time, and I think one of the big issues isn't those individual items themselves, it's the actual change process is the key issue that needs to be addressed, because this is actually quite difficult to change. And when you look at the sort of the history of the water sector in local government, it's been fairly encased in there with that lack of change for a very long time, and unless we sort of address that change process, I can't see things really moving along very fast.
Yeah. Raveen?
Sort out
the mic. Okay, we'll go to Karl.
I sort of see this, I mean, we're all sort of aware of the issues in the water sector. I sort of see the opportunity as much as something that's not unique to the water sector in New Zealand. We're a small country, except we try and do things 20, 30 times over as opposed to, working as a collective. I mean, the All Black team's drawn from the entire nation. It's not, a bunch of sort of little teams. So I think the real opportunity here with forming a scale provider is really the expertise that not only can be in that organisation, but as our last speaker said, it enables then the private sector to respond to, because they can then see, look, this is what we're going to try and do over the next period of time, and look at maybe in all parts of the country, but at least then they know they're dealing with a with a procurer who knows what they're doing, there's certainty what they're doing, and they have similar processes. These sort of things just lead to more efficiency going forward, in my view.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
Is it working?
Not really.
Sure. Okay. Right, well, I'll get to our first sort of question about the need for a regulator and the role of a regulator in New Zealand. So, as the Minister has touched on, they're looking to make a decision next year about a regulator. And look, one of the slides that Richard had up there, which I was just fascinated by, is that at present, our sort of drinking water environment is regulated by 67 local authorities, 20 DHBs, 36 drinking water assessors, 16 regional councils, and 7 ministries. So surely it must be beneficial to slim that down and have the one regulator.
Yeah, well, it's not a typical water regulatory environment, which I think both the Minister and Richard outlined in their discussions. So, and as was highlighted, it's sort of highly complicated. It's decentralised. A lot of the monitoring doesn't happen, and more often than not, that's just again related back to capacity and funding ability of the 67 and the other regulators who are involved in that environment.
Yeah.
I'll probably, in some ways, jumping on a little bit to the next one, but I'll leave it to the gentleman to talk around, regulation, the water sector itself. But what I can say is regulated utilities generally, attract some of the lowest cost of capital that we have, in the capital markets, and that's debt and equity. We can talk about that a little bit later on, but to me, one of the sort of criticisms is saying take it out of councils, putting it into sort of a big body like this. There's an increased cost of capital. I'd actually counter that. If there is any increase, it's very marginal, just because of that regulatory side of things. So I think the regulation from that point of view is a key part of it.
Yeah, no, that's right. And look, I am trying to pick up on one of the Slido questions, but the question is, why are we looking to reinvent the wheel? This has been done in the electricity sector, economic regulation, corporatisation, change in ownership structure. So look, as there are other sectors that have the one single regulator, and it has proven to be an efficient model. Raveen, how are you?
I think the key issue is we've got regulations now, drinking water regulations, but they're not mandatory.
Yeah.
And so the first thing is that the regulations need to become mandatory.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. And then we've got to have a regulator that has teeth.
Yeah.
That there are consequences when regulations are not being met.
Yeah.
So that's from a drinking water.
Yeah.
And then if we are talking about affordability and the need to get the right pricing and financing and revenue from the consumers, and the inability, probably can't hear me. Sorry, so what I was saying is what we need is mandatory regulations rather than just a regulator. Because we've got regulations at the moment, but they're not mandatory. So firstly, our regulations have to be mandatory, and there have to be consequences if the regulations are not being met. And therefore, we need a regulator that has got the powers, the teeth, to take action when the water utilities or suppliers or councils fail to meet the standards. So that's from a drinking water point of view.
Yeah.
You think I should? Oh,
Yeah.
right. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And then if we move on to the economic regulator, that is around pricing. So if the suppliers of water, council, utilities, if they fail to collect the right amount of money for political reasons, then we need an economic regulator so that they can set the right parameters for the charges, and also to protect the consumers that they're not being overcharged. So it very much depends on whether it's 2 waters or 3 waters. If it's 3 waters, it does bring in the environmental regulation in as well, and then the whole issue around RMA. So it's a complex issue.
Yeah, no, definitely. But do you think there is, so even though there's 3 potentially regulatory aspects in terms of health with drinking water and environmental, that they could all be consolidated under one?
Whether there's one regulator that looks after all 3 aspects, or whether there are 3 different regulators, I think that's a conversation to be had.
Yeah.
I don't have an opinion at this point in time. I think there are pros and cons of doing that.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess that sort of aggregation type aspect sort of leads to the second question, which is that actually, so stepping away from regulation but looking at the supply side of things. So one of the things that the Three Waters Review is looking at is the aggregation of the dedicated suppliers. And just keen to hear each of the panel members' views on this. I think as the Minister has touched on, this will take a little longer to work through, and there is quite a lot of, sort of tension in this area as they are, consulting a lot with the local government to work everything through. So, Karl, I think you sort of touched on the aggregation and economies of scale and
bit before,
efficiency.
but and I personally see a great benefit in aggregation around efficiency, expertise, and excuse the pun, pipeline. But we also need to be cognizant of the small regions. It was touched on, the small councils with 50% of their revenue from things like water. So, look, we have to be careful how we do it. But I think if we've got a burning platform here, we have people dying. So, to me, people dying sort of beats politics most days of the week. But
yeah, I'd endorse what Karl was saying. I mean, it's evident from the studies and the speakers earlier in the various study tours that there is a clear correlation between scale, efficiency, capability. But I think we need an intelligent approach to how the actual structuring works. So often you find, as Richard pointed out, that rugby union boundaries seem to have a nice resonance to them. But I think there needs to be some real intelligent thought around how that structuring works, because you do actually get outliers. Some of the medium-sized authorities run their water and wastewater services quite well, but clearly when you get down to the really small guys, it's a real struggle where you've got an infrastructure manager and he's looking after everything from water regulation to the colour of the paint on the public toilets down the road. And as Raveen highlighted, it's a highly complex area.
Yeah. And Raveen, I know you've got obviously some experiences with Watercare and the consolidation sort of that's gone on there. And look, one of the questions that's been posed is how easily and quickly could you scale the Watercare or Wellington Water models? So just interested for your thoughts on consolidation, and then I guess how quickly this could be done.
Yeah, well, so in 2010, when Auckland was, the councils were amalgamated, we inherited Rodney and Franklin, which had quite a large deferred investment, I would say. In fact, they were incapable of affording to upgrade their water and wastewater treatment plants as a community. So aggregation happened, socialization of costs happened, and we spent over 3 years, over $500 million in Rodney and Franklin upgrading water and wastewater services. So the first point is that those councils would never have been able to afford that. So socialization was necessary. The second point is, in terms of mobilizing resources to do the work, so funds, people, that's not difficult. New Zealand has the capability to do that. The key thing that's missing is leadership, followed by money.
Right. Okay. What about one of the questions is, we hear from communities that they want to be able to influence their water services, and that aligns quite closely with a theme I know that local government NZ is quite passionate about at the moment, and that is sort of localism. But the question is, but what should we retain community influence over in an aggregated model? I mean, is it a question around chlorination? There's a lot of questions, obviously, and things the community do want to influence, but is there anything that you think is...
Well, I think where a decision has been made that a public utility or council is going to supply the services, it very much depends on how that entity is set up. So from my point of view, if I'm going to run an organization, then I'm not going to kill anyone. I mean, that's the way I am, right?
Yeah.
And if I had to work there, I would resign. But I think what is happening here in New Zealand is we're having the wrong conversations, okay? So the conversations are being driven by fear. So the conversation is around chlorination. It's not about chlorination. The discussion is about whether people should receive safe, secure water. If to achieve that you need to chlorinate, then you chlorinate. If you can do it some other way, you do it some other way. So the conversation isn't about chlorination. Similarly, when you talk about local input, yes, I think there's a need to have local input. But as a country, we need to decide whether the local behaviors is going to impact the country. So when 4 people died in Havelock North, the news media globally were not saying that 4 people died in Havelock North. They said 4 people died in New Zealand. Okay, so that has an impact on New Zealand's reputation as a tourist destination. And that's, I think, councils need to think about the greater good. And the aggregation question really needs to be answered around where are the economic centres in New Zealand that can afford to socialise the necessary costs. So we can have 16 entities running the business. Do we have 16 regional economic centres that will be able to socialise the cost? I mean, I don't have the answer, but those are the questions. So I think we need to identify what the drivers are, and I think the Minister and Richard have covered that extremely well. It is definitely a very thorough process. And we will have technical answers which have to be overlaid by the realities of politics.
Yeah.
Just building on what Raveen was saying too around sort of having national principles around water standards. I mean, one of the issues is that a lot of those very small councils have very iconic tourist facilities or amenities in their districts. So from a economic point of view, it's quite critical that those areas have the appropriate standards.
Yeah. And I guess touching on that, the appropriate funds as well. If there is aggregation, then there will be efficiencies and hopefully more of a sort of appropriate funding model as well. I don't know, Karl, just on that funding aspect.
I think it is there is a real question of scale. I mean, we can't forget, New Zealand is small. There has to be a degree of socialisation. I mean, the Punakaki Rocks toilet example, where they, I don't know how many 100,000 visitors they get a year. They can never afford to do that. There has to be a degree of socialisation, but I mean that's sort of the revenue side. I think what the socialisation or the aggregation does, even to the large population centres, is drive more efficiency, drive more expertise, drive more economies of scale, and then we can see the benefits for all centres, which there are, I'm pretty sure. So.
Right. Okay. And just look, We will have a quick chat about privatisation. Look, I know that the government has reiterated that it is a core pillar of part of their Three Waters review, that the three water assets are to remain under public ownership. But just, Raveen, I don't know if you've got any ideas, thoughts about privatisation in three water sector in New Zealand?
Well, my personal view is that the private sector is very involved in the water industry. So we're a monopoly service provider, and one of the ways in which we demonstrate that we're getting value for our customers is by going to market on the components of what we do. So we get consultants to design our work, we get contractors to construct, we get contractors to do the maintenance, we get contractors to read the meters, we get contractors to send the bills. The ownership of the assets and the management of the assets is what is the emotional aspect. So at this point in time, if the country is not prepared for whatever reason, then why go down that path? The reality is the private sector is very involved in the water sector.
Yeah, and endorse those views, because it goes back to my point about change and the willingness of people to change, let alone the fact that the way the industry is structured, if you were actually looking at a sort of a sale process, it's not really in any state where you could actually go to the market with. But it is that change. Why would you want to put that in the way of the change?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably be a little bit contra. I think you should always consider a privatisation model. I think a regulated utility is a perfect asset for a super fund, for a Kiwi saver, for and we need to encourage this sort of asset in the market as well. Look, I don't disagree that I think emotionally or the public's not there, but I do think it's worthy of a debate.
Yeah, and I found it interesting to know, I mean, CCOs, council-controlled organisations, can be up to 49% privately owned. So I just, so I wonder if there is that sort of balance there by saying, hey, you could have a New Zealand super fund that had 49%. And
well, I would say ownership of water utilities by the super fund and ACC is not privatisation. The public would see that as public ownership.
Yeah.
But then it all gets a little bit technical, because then you say, well, why can't my KiwiSaver own it? My KiwiSaver fund. I mean, I've probably got more direct ownership in that than I do in ACC or super fund similar, I guess.
You're being reasonable and rational.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, but yeah.
No, I think, it's interesting in terms of tapping into that funding and the money and whether there is sort of an opportunity there. Look, one of the questions that has got 2 thumbs up beside it, so I should ask, but it is a very big question. But Raveen, what do you think is the right water structure for New Zealand in your personal? I know, I told you, it was a big question.
Well, this has to be my personal view.
Yes, your personal view. Yeah.
So I have to say that the Watercare model is not perfect. So our current challenge is that while we are a $10 billion company and have debts of only 1.6 billion, so very lazy balance sheet, we are unable to leverage that because we are owned by council, and council has got a challenge. So we don't have a perfect structure. But the aggregation, the fact that we have got the independence and the autonomy, the stuff that Chris was talking about, corporatisation of the Australian entities, well, that's where we are. So my personal view is not privatisation, but definitely a corporatised model with some sort of public ownership where the balance sheet of the water entity can be fully utilised and leveraged.
Very interesting. David?
Yeah, I haven't really got a fixed view in terms of the numbers. I mean, you do want an entity that has the scale, but that obviously needs to be defined, and the ability, as Raveen pointed out, to use its balance sheet. So whether that number is 12, 5, 3, I think work needs to be done. But that's the beauty of the process at the moment, that there's an opportunity to actually try and understand what would that optimal position be. And it may be, again, when you're looking at how you actually move to that new state, it's interesting how in a lot of the reforms around the world, often there's been a sort of like a double aggregation, like there's been an initial aggregation, such as in Tasmania, and then further amalgamation, and maybe that's sensible, again, to make the change more palatable.
Yeah, and I think that is acknowledged as part of the Three Waters review, that it's not going to be a jump to the finish line.
Yeah.
It is going to be sort of a slow process, so I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm a sort of a less is more person. I think if we draw an analogy with what happened, when the lines companies, were set up, you still, apart from a few, you still don't have scale in the lines companies in New Zealand, and ironically, because they're regulated and because they're regionally owned, it's very hard for them to amalgamate. It's hard for the economic rationale argument to overcome, to bring these in, to bring the efficiencies in. So my personal view is less is more. Go for smaller numbers people are happy with. But
Okay, that's great. Sorry, I'm just trying to pull up. Questions have disappeared.
some down there, yeah.
Sorry, I can't quite. Oh, there. Sorry. Yeah. So that is. I mean, I took that. That was a point that was raised, but just a subsidisation issue. So, whether in terms of it being a good idea for the cities to be subsidising water in rural areas, thanks, where we are struggling with the affordability of housing in our cities. So look, I agree. I think that jumps to mind, in Auckland, if you talked about Auckland subsidising sort of the wider rural area, or Northland perhaps, if that was sort of the aggregation that was happening, and how that plays out on an equity basis. And as pointed out by the question, when people are struggling with the affordability of housing. But I don't know if that cross-subsidisation, anyone has thoughts on that?
Look, I said before, I think there has to be a bit of socialisation of the cost. I think, when we look at Auckland, if we're talking Three Waters, correct me if I'm wrong, but stormwater's not in Watercare. So we've got some big stormwater expenditure that we need to do in Auckland. How about socialising some of that as well? I mean, the more the better, I think.
Yeah.
I think if you had aggregated entities too, you'd have the ability to sort of prioritise what's important. Because, going back to that point about, the public toilets at Punakaiki, I think there's about 200 residents there, and they get something like half a million visitors. It's clearly important to the tourist economy that we have that facility there, but you can't expect the 200 residents to fund the costs of that service. So I think cross-subsidisation is inevitable, and I thought Richard had some quite good figures around some of those costs, particularly in the drinking water. Didn't look that scary in terms of cross-subsidisation.
Yeah, what was it, 0.67 cents or something? Yeah, to bring that up. No, agree. I don't know, Raveen.
I think the subsidisation issue is an emotional one, and we just need to have the correct narrative to get the public around it, because the private sector socialises costs. There are many products that you buy right across New Zealand and it's got the same price. That doesn't mean that that's what the actual cost of selling it in those places are. So what we've got to do is accept that there's a greater good for New Zealand. We've got to think about New Zealand incorporated, and larger cities, including Auckland, and I'm not speaking on behalf of my councillors because I don't have that mandate, but my own view as a ratepayer would be we owe it to the country. We cannot live in one city while smaller councils are struggling to meet basic fundamental needs of keeping their people safe from drinking water.
Yeah, and it's that point that you highlighted before, that the media reports on Havelock North were that 4 people died in New Zealand, so it is much more a NZ Inc. type issue, and something that we need to get right for tourism and sort of the greater good of New Zealand. That's right. And look, one of the questions, and I know, Raveen, you'll have a view on this, is whether storm water belongs with the other 2 waters, or should it be delivered separately?
Yeah, I definitely have a view on this.
Your personal view.
So I think firstly, when we talk about 3 waters, and Richard had 4 waters, but he didn't touch on it. I was going to ask him what the 4th water was. You know, and we sort of joke about it within Watercare that there are 38 waters. But the reality is, what is the 3rd water? Is it storm water that is in pipes? Is it all of rain, which includes flood protection? What is it? And I don't think that has been defined. And therefore the conversations that are taking place has got different meanings. So for me personally, it depends on the framework we set up. Water and wastewater are easily charged for based on consumption. Stormwater is a public good. It has got a strong land use capability. It can be part of the 3 waters business. It is in Europe, in Netherlands, but a grant is paid by the councils to the water utility to manage stormwater. If it is all water, then there's a conflict between the agency that is responsible for allocating water, currently regional councils and in Auckland Council. If the water utility is the consumer of that water and allocates water to itself, that fundamentally is wrong in my view. So you need some other agency that is responsible for allocating natural water and looking after the protection of that water source. So I think, you know, there's a deeper discussion that needs to take place, starting with the definition of the 3rd water.
Yeah. This is interesting because this debate was also had by the Auckland Transition Agency when we had the reforms in 2010 and Watercare was established. But in picking up on what Raveen was saying, it was felt at the time it was just more straightforward to have the 2 network piped assets all in the same body and not complicate it with stormwater, albeit Auckland has the common, that has the combined. Right. So, I mean, that was the feeling at that stage. That, I mean, it was a big change, and to make that, ensure that change was successful and de-risk it, stormwater wasn't included. And when you think organisation like Auckland Transport's got significant stormwater assets in the road, so you know you get into all those sorts of debates. A lot of the water courses are on parks, so it just really complicates the whole environment if you actually move beyond 2 waters.
Yep, no, that's really interesting. No, Karl.
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll leave it to these gentlemen. Far too much for my expertise. But.
Well, look, we've been given the bell, I think, to nearly wrap up. But if anyone's got any sort of comments that they'd like to make that I sort of haven't touched on, don't want to talk about irrigation?
No. Which one's that? The 8th water or something? But yeah, no, I'll leave that for another day. But,
I think I would just make the comment that I think storytelling's quite important in this change.
Yeah.
And you know we've touched on a number of aspects, whether it's sort of cross-subsidisation or some of the other elements, and there needs to be that sort of wider public understanding of the issues around the way water is delivered and managed. So I think that's quite critical, and it's just not about the numbers.
I would say that the Minister Mahuta and the government have shown a lot of courage And as Richard has indicated, they're truly proceeding in a partnership manner. So I think we collectively need to provide feedback.
Yeah.
So I would encourage every one of us, every one of you here, in your own way, to put your views into that mix, because we can't sit back and think someone else is going to solve this problem. It's a complex problem, and it will become a political problem, and therefore the politicians need to know what the communities and the stakeholders are actually thinking. It deserves the debate. It deserves the engagement by all of us. So I think it would be irresponsible of us to sit here and not actually put our views into that conversation. That's what I'm going to say.
I think that's a very nice way to wrap it up. And I think, you know, as Richard did emphasise, they really are looking for everyone's views on this. So again, encourage that feedback and collaboration. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Afternoon tea's upon us. A big thank you, though, to the panel again. I thought that was very interesting and very diverse range of feedback and input, which is great. There is one question. We covered the ownership model. One question, Slido question, if you could all give us your views so we reach some sort of consensus in this room, which will then be carried through. Probably not. Slido question, I think, coming up shortly. Well, it might be on your, if it's on your device. Oh, there it is. Which service delivery model would work best for New Zealand? Consolidate into a single national provider, a few large public providers, partially privatise, keep arrangements as we have now, full privatisation. Still moving around a bit. Watch the space. I think we're getting a clear winner. Anyone else? Still going? Okay, I think we might stop there. I think that the top one keeps gaining. A few large public providers, so that's probably not too much of a surprise. Anyway, look, thank you again for your time for the water sector reform discussion. I think it's been fantastic, quite diverse range. Our friends from across the Tasman helping us with what's going over there, Great having the Minister here, but now's a good time to have a break and a cup of tea. The technology sesh stream is in this room, and the rail stream is in the main room. Thank you very much.